Okay, I want to talk about inverses. Remind you, you already know how to do inverses, but we'll just talk a little, look at a couple examples of that, and compositions here first. So, do you remember going back to Algebra 2? We haven't really done a lot of this year, but going back to Algebra 2, do you remember what the recipe is for finding the inverse of a function?
Possibly.
Remember that. You're going to talk a lot more about this next year. One of the things I want to be familiar with is how to take a function and find its inverse. Okay? Not hard to do. See if this rings a bell. If it's written in terms of, you want to write it in terms of y. So if that were written as f of x equals cube root of x minus 1 plus 2, write it in terms of y. And then all you have to do, once you've written it in terms of x and y, is we're just going to exchange the x's and y's and solve for the new y. And that's our inverse. Okay, so flip the x's and y's. So that gives us, if we do that, this becomes an x, and this becomes a y. Okay? And then now I just isolate the y. I'm just solving for y in terms of x. So what are the steps I would go through in order to solve for y there? What would I do first? Okay, I'm going to subtract 2. Good. Okay, so, whoops. Okay, subtract 2, then what?
Get rid of the square root.
It's not a square root. Okay, how do I get rid of a cube root?
1 over 3.
Okay, so that's to the power of 1/3, but how do I get rid of that? How do I undo a cube root?
What's a cube it?
Cube both sides, right? So I cube both sides to get rid of that, and then what do I do finally?
Add 1.
Add 1, okay? Oops, I won't do that. Oh, I won't do that either. Do that. Okay, so let's look at those steps real quick then. So if I subtract 2, x minus 2 equals the cube root of y minus 1. Cube both sides. Right? The cube undoes the cube root. And so then I have y minus 1 equals the quantity x minus 2 cubed, which I could cube out. If I cube that out, I'm going to get Now, how did I do that so fast? You have the option of just FOILing out x minus 2 times x minus 2 times x minus 2, or you might remember, at some point you're going to want to make this transition. We know that a plus b quantity cubed. Remember, this is a cubed plus 3a squared b plus 3ab squared plus b cubed. It was in 6.3, an expansion pattern. In this case, my a would be x, and my b would be negative 2. And so if I just substituted those things in there, that's what I'm going to get. You don't have to do it that way, but it is quicker. Okay, the alternative is just to FOIL it all out. So there's a little shortcut. Either way I do it, though, just add 1 to both sides now, and I got it. Y equals x cubed minus 6x squared plus 12x. Add 1, I just get minus 7. Okay. And I don't even think, I'm having you, I'll look at the question here, but I don't even think you have to simplify the answer. I think you could have just left it as the quantity x minus 2 cubed plus 1. It's fine. Okay. If I look up here, yeah, it doesn't say that, but I don't think I specified in here. I don't really care if you do all the expansion. I just want you to know what's the recipe for finding the inverse. Okay, let's try another one. How would I do this guy? What are the steps I would go through with this guy to get the x by itself?
Subtract 3.
Oh, raise your hand. First I do what? Okay, subtract 3. What's next? After you subtract 3, what are we going to do? What do you think? Yes. Okay, square both sides to get rid of the square root. Good. And then finally, subtract 2. Yeah, we got it, right? Okay. What about, let's look at one of these kind down here. What if we had, let's look at this one real quick. Let me make this a little bigger so you can see it. We want to find the inverse of y equals 3x cubed minus 2. Okay, so now if I'm finding an inverse, what do? Switch x and y. Good. So that becomes my x. Okay, what's next? Okay, reverse order of operations. So I'm going to add 2. If I'm going to isolate y, add 2. Good. So x plus 2 was 3y cubed. What's next? Divide by 3. Okay. And then finally, no. Okay, so the 1/3 power, so cube rooted, right? So I end up with y equals cube root of x plus 2 over 3. And you know, once again, how do we enter that in Moodle? There is no cube root. Good. We'll write it as a 1/3 power. Because remember, a cube root is just a 1/3 power. So Moodle, we've just entered that as the quantity x plus 2 all divided by 3. That whole quantity raised to the 1/3. Okay, that's how we do cube root. That whole thing to the 1/3 means the cube root of that whole thing. Okay? So there's that one. Now, one more I want to do that's just a little bit tricky. What about this one? Let's go through these steps. This one's a little tricky. Okay, if I'm finding an inverse, what's the rule? What do I do first? Switch the x's and y's. All of the x's and y's. So that means that not only does this become an x and that become a y, even this restriction over here has to be switched. So that's going to become a restriction in terms of y. So we end up with x equals 3y squared minus 2 with the restriction that y is less than or equal to 0. So y is non-positive, right? It could be 0 or negative. Okay, so now what are the steps I go through in order to isolate the y there? First everybody, first I what? Add 2. Then divide by 3. And take the square root. Okay, good. So then, if I do that stuff, okay, divide by 3, and then square root. So I end up with, now when I square root both sides, I'm going to put the y over here. What else needs to go there if I square root both sides? Remember, if I take an even root of both sides, I got to have that plus or minus there. Okay, because that's even. I need a plus or minus, right? Okay, but now look what we got here. We've got this restriction that y has to be less than or equal to 0. Okay, so what does that mean? When we get this plus or minus, what's that telling us about the plus or minus? It's got to be the negative, doesn't it? Right? When I take the square root of something, I'm always going to get back an answer that's, I can never get a negative answer from the square root, right? The square root of 9 is 3. The square root of 100 is 10. The square root of 0 is 0. There's no way I'm going to get back a negative number out of that unless I multiply it by -1, right? So that restriction over here is telling us that that needs to be out there. We need to have that negative sign in front of the square root. That makes sense? That's a tricky one, I think. The easy thing to do is to forget that that x also gets switched to a y. Okay? All right, so that's inverses in a nutshell. That's how we find inverses. Get a little practice.